Thank you so much, Christoph, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you not just to Christoph, obviously, to all the staff of the RCC, to my fellows here at the RCC, to the students who I've had the pleasure to meet. It's been wonderful the past two... Whoa, who's that? Is that you, Faye? Wow, what a pleasure. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Do you want to have a seat? Do you want to sit down?
No, Idema. I'm going to stand.
Okay. Well, welcome. How's Munich been so far?
Not very pleasant.
Okay. Okay. So, nice to have you here. Okay, let me go on with my talk. So, I'm here to talk with you about my book project, which is entitled Environmental Posthumanism, Narrating Humans and Worlds in Transformation. My book is forthcoming in the Routledge book series Perspectives on the Non-Human in Literature and Science. And so I'm here to tell you a little bit about my book, and specifically one chapter in the book. What we're going to do is we're going to Mars. And this is not fiction. This is reality. In 2030, we quote unquote, will be going to Mars. There's a Dutch entrepreneur, Bas Lansdorp, who's launched Mars One, a manned mission to Mars, due in 2030, and NASA is also going to Mars, obviously, at the same time, roughly. So the people who go there can't come back. That's impossible. So it will be a permanent colony on Mars. Now, of course, we've already been to Mars in the imagination a lot of times, and perhaps the most famous and most celebrated work of fiction on Mars is Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars Trilogy. I've put this quote on the slide to remind you in need of the fact that our world has become science fiction. Like Christoph also said, I believe that 1 year ago we had no doubt about the fact that our life is science fiction when Donald Trump came down the escalator. That was pure science fiction. Anyway, this trilogy interests me for a number of reasons, but in the context of this book, I'm interested in the way in which the human beings, the scientists who go to Mars, actually transform in ways they haven't thought about. So they're not just changing the planet, they're not just going there and changing the planet Mars, but they're actually undergoing a kind of experiment with themselves. And I call this perspective, this literary, theoretical perspective, environmental posthumanism. Environmental posthumanism asks two questions, I think. The first is, how are human and non-human environments entangled in transformative ways? So I want to emphasize the transformative here, because that things are entangled is a cliche, I think, by now. We're not always, I think, aware that they're transformatively entangled, at least potentially. And the second question is, how can stories enable us to gain cognitive, emotional, and ethical understanding of this relationship? And I think stories are tremendously important. And this is also a statement of relevance that follows up on the last talk here at the RCC, Noel Healy's talk on climate change, and his call for new frames and new narratives to think about our relationship, not just to the environment, but to politics, to activism, to society at large. So I think science fiction is a great resource for many people in different disciplines to think about how we relate to our changing world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of literary transformations, which I suppose starts with mythology, obviously, but we could make it start here for this occasion with Ovid and his Metamorphoses, a famous work in which divine creatures transform into humans or other animals. And a similar movement we can see in the Bible, where we see the person of Jesus becoming, or perhaps already being, in a sense, divine. And I put this picture of the Transfiguration by Raphael, the famous Italian painter. So there's a kind of transformation in this body of Jesus into a more divine entity. And of course, if we skip to the 20th century to 1915, we see Kafka writing Die Verwandlung, the Metamorphosis, a magical sort of strange transformation novel in which the protagonist finds himself in bed waking up as an insect. Okay, these are divinely or magically ordained transformations. Then, of course, we have time and temporality. If you play with time, you can see evolution, right? If you stretch time by millions of years, you can see in Olaf Stapleton's Last and First Men that there are a succession of human races, human species, as many as 18. And the novel covers, I think, multiple million years. And then, of course, a character in a story can also play with time if he has a time machine. H.G. Wells' The Time Machine is a classic. It has been adapted to film in 1960. I put this nice picture, I think, on the slide. An Eloi being massaged by a Morlock. So the Eloi are the feeble-minded, hedonistic creatures that live on the surface of the earth, but under the surface, underground, the Morlocks, the brutish creatures of the dark, are doing all the hard work. It's a very Marxist novel, and I think there's more than a little resemblance to the RCC. If you see the second floor and the fourth floor. So, and then thirdly, there are technologically mediated transformations, and these are the most familiar, I think, to us. If you think of science fiction, most of the time, human transformations are made possible through technology. Frankenstein is obviously a case in point, and for many critics, this is the beginning of science fiction. And there are, of course, all kinds of mutants around us in fiction. Mutants that sort of came into existence because of pathogens, viruses, radiation, and so on. So this is another, off-spin of technological intervention, right? Nuclear disasters that then lead to mutation. But I'm interested in my book in a different kind of transformation narrative that I think has not been properly addressed yet. And this is a kind of quote-unquote spontaneous evolution event. So these are the 4 case studies I do. I won't go into every one of them, but what basically happens in all of these narratives is that the human race transforms in interaction with environments. Sometimes this environment is a planet. Sometimes this environment is a different species, an alien species. Sometimes this environment is actually inside the human. Maybe the human body itself is an environment harboring all kinds of other species that may have some role in our evolution. If I summarize Greg Bear's Darwin's Radio. So in this talk I'm going to speak about just one of the case studies, Kim Stanley Robinson's celebrated Mars Trilogy. So what happens here? Okay, these scientists go on a mission to Mars. And while they're in the spaceship, they already concoct a variety of plans that go way beyond the initial project, right? Initially, they were like, okay, we're going to Mars and we're going to conduct a number of experiments. Geology, physics, biology, and so forth. Once they get there, it turns out that they've already changed their minds along the way. They want to create a new world, right? They want to create a new world. And this happens in a period of 200 years. So it's a very long trilogy, 2,300 pages, and 200 years of history. So the planet Mars changes from red to green and then to blue. How does that work? Well, you introduce microbes that excrete oxygen and then change the composition of the atmosphere, which becomes breathable for first, of course, for mosses and for lichens and other creatures, and then insects are introduced, and then different species. And so after a while, you have a sort of forest or a tundra, and then by using mirrors outside the orbit of Mars, you warm up the atmosphere, so you reflect sunlight into the atmosphere, and then it becomes so warm that the ice cap melts, which leads to oceans, seas, lakes, rivers, a blue planet. So this is terraformation, and terraformation is not an invention of Kim Stanley Robinson. It's NASA and other people, and actually other science fiction authors very early in the 20th century who thought about these possibilities. So the trilogy, the first part especially, is characterized by a debate, a conflict between two groups: the terraformation group, led by Sax Russell, a physicist, and the opposition, led by Anne Claiborne, the Reds, who want to, as the name says, they want to keep the planet red. So who are we, who are humans, to go to this other planet and dominate it and change it, right? Maybe there are life forms on Mars already. We don't know that. Maybe under the ice or somewhere hidden there are life forms, and once we terraform this planet, they might extinguish. They might die. So there's this debate. Of course, the terraformation group wins, right? They win in a way. So what we see in this novel is that a scientific problem turns into a political problem. They start debating each other. And one of the most vocal characters in this regard is Arkady Bogdanovich, a Russian scientist, part of the Reds. And this is what he says halfway the first part of the trilogy. We have come to Mars for good. We are going to make not only our homes and our food, but also our water and the very air we breathe, all on a planet that has none of these things. We can do this because we have technology to manipulate matter right down to the molecular level. This is an extraordinary ability, think of it. And yet some of us here can accept transforming the entire physical reality of this planet without doing a single thing to change ourselves or the way we live. I say that among all the things we transform on Mars, ourselves and our social reality should be among them. End quote. So this statement by Arkady is well, if you read the novel, it is a communist statement. It is a statement about making a world together, democratically, but also changing the architecture of the society. Moving away from Earth means moving to a new world, but also a new society. Unfortunately for Arkady, it doesn't really happen. So by the end of the first part of the trilogy, there's more confrontations, more violence and stuff. There's no communist society on the horizon. But there's one thing about his statement that does happen, and that is that humans change. And initially this change is technologically mediated, for sure. And I want to single out one way in which humans transform, and that is through the longevity treatment, which is basically a DNA repair treatment in the novel. So scientists get this treatment, their DNA is repaired every once in a while, and they just stay young. They stay young. Isn't that attractive? Isn't that a great idea? And the sort of the end point of this fantasy, of course, is immortality, right? Why should we die? It's so lame, right? It's like it's a cliche, and it's a waste. It's a waste. We can cure any disease. Why can't we cure death? Death is just a mechanism in the body, right? We can program our DNA differently so that we don't die. This is not science fiction. This is actually science. People in Cambridge, Oxford, and other places are pursuing this kind of hypotheses. All right, this is another instance of science and fiction becoming indistinguishable. But there are many ways in which, of course, these people have to adapt to this new planet, right? Spacesuits are part of that, computers, and so there's a lot needed to be able to live on a different world. Is that right?
Yes, very much so.
So, actually, actually I'm clicking back. All of this changes in the second part of the trilogy. All of this terraformation, human enhancement, is put in a very different perspective. So when the second part starts, there's a key passage, I think, that does the work of shifting the perspective towards a biological and ecological frame. Of course, all the genetic templates for our new biota are Terran. The minds designing them are Terran. But the terrain is Martian, and terrain is a powerful genetic engineer, determining what flourishes and what doesn't, pushing along progressive differentiation and thus the evolution of new species. And as the generations pass, all the members of a biosphere evolve together, adapting to their terrain in a complex communal response, a creative, self-designing ability. This process, no matter how much we intervene in it, is essentially out of our control. Genes mutate, creatures evolve, a new biosphere emerges, and with it, a new noosphere. And eventually, the designer's minds, along with everything else, have been forever changed. So I think this passage here encapsulates what I call environmental posthumanism. Environmental posthumanism, which is not a perspective derived from scholarship in humanities by people like Rosie Braidotti, Stacia Lemo, Cernella Iovino, Heather Sullivan and others, but also very much on biological theories of interaction, of emergence, symbiosis, and so on. And I really think that reading literature today, and in particular reading science fiction, requires this engagement with scientific discourses. And I think this is also, the scholars I mentioned and other scholars are aware of that, but there are also a lot of scholars that are, I think, not putting emphasis on that or not finding it all too relevant. All too often I find that the argument is, let's look at literature and film and culture because we need the imagination, not science. We need narratives, not facts. Right? This kind of opposition is, I think, very common. I want to sort of try and go beyond that with other people who try to do the same. And so I read science fiction as a symbiosis between narrative techniques, making us think of what is it like to be a human being in this time, in this place, right? But also thinking through scientific discourses that may be unfamiliar, uncomfortable, difficult, and so on. So this is what Robinson does. His narrative is interspersed with these segments of scientific discourse that are often quite difficult to follow. So here, the narrative of terraformation enhancement is transformed into an ecological problem. An ecological problem for scientists, but perhaps also an ecological problem for ecology, for the ecosystem, for the planet, right, at the same time. So there's a transition, and this is a transition from terraformation to aerial formation. Aerial formation is derived from the word Ares, that's the Latin word for Mars. So instead of Mars becoming like the Earth, a new Terra, the humans become like Mars, they become Martians. Okay, aerial formations. And John Boone, the mission leader, already has this sense in the first part of the trilogy. He says, we terraform the planet, but the planet aeroforms us. And this actually comes true in a very literal sense in the second part of the trilogy, when a new generation of Martians is born. So new Martian children are born on this planet, and they turn out to be quite different. And this is how the narrator describes it. Members of the old Homo sapiens were now cohabiting the planet with a new Homo ares, creatures tall and slender and graceful and utterly at home. Okay, so we have a kind of a bimodal distribution, like in the Time Machine, with two species of humans cohabiting the planet, planet Mars. How is that possible? Do biological theories underwrite this scenario? Yes and no, I guess. We don't know, would be the short answer, I suppose. But certainly the dominant theory of neo-Darwinist genetic biology doesn't allow for this scenario. So it is a challenge to the dominant evolutionary paradigm in the life sciences. For sure, a provocative one may be pushing it too far, but that's the role of science fiction, pushing things further. And I read this really through the biological theory of developmental systems theory developed by Susan Oyama and her colleagues already in the 1970s, right, early 1980s. What is developmental systems theory? Maybe I can just read the quote right away from Oyama, because I think it explains what I mean in the Mars trilogy. The environment must be seen not only as a resource of phenotypic variance, but as fundamental to species character, and not only as passive support, but as equal partner with the genes in giving rise to living beings. Vital patterns are the result of interactive systems at many levels. The whole work of Susan Oyama has been a critique of the genocentric view of life and the neo-Darwinist view of life. Neo-Darwinism says that the way creatures evolve is that genes mutate very slowly, at a very slow rate, in a random way, and then natural selection does all the work of sort of creating the species. We don't know what natural selection really is. It's kind of phantom, but it does all of that. And the book of life is in DNA, right? That's the dominant metaphor of the life sciences. Maybe still today, maybe it's changed already. But Oyama says, well, there's two problems with that. First of all, it's not a book. The genetic code consists of zeros and ones. It's a binary code, but that's not a narrative, right? That's just a couple of symbols. That's not a narrative. It's not a book. Second of all, it's not a book of life. Life is contained in cells, is contained in organisms, in environments, ecosystems, not in a molecule, and certainly not in just one molecule. A molecule is at most a resource or a part of a system, a part of a narrative, right? So the writing of life occurs on different levels at the same time, in interaction between different media, between different bodies, in a kind of emergent fashion. The writing goes on, and we cannot trace its beginning or its end, which is also true for the Mars trilogy, which of course has a beginning. It has a first page and it has a last page, but it's very much a narrative about going on, struggling on, thinking, keeping thinking, evolving, changing. So the final part of the Mars trilogy may come across as slightly utopian in the sense of giving a synthesis, a sort of perfect synthesis between the two characters I mentioned before, Anne Claiborne of the Reds and Sax Russell representing terraformation. They come together, they fall in love, obviously. They go on a trip to the ocean and sail the Martian Sea. Very nice. Of course, the trouble is not over. The trouble is going on. There's a lot of problems in Martian society and also on different planets, because they've moved to different planets as well by the time of the third part of the trilogy. But I do think that this synthesis is still interesting because it suggests that science is not static. Science is not a repository of facts or theories. It is a changing thing, right? And scientists can change their opinions and their views, and they do, especially when they encounter other scientists and when they are ready to open up their views to politics, to the outside world. And this is also how I'd like to end my presentation, because, well, why are these narratives interesting? First of all, to come back to the relevance of eco-criticism and of narrative, I think we need to experiment with narrativity, with narrative, and not just the form, but also the content of narrative. What are narratives about? Right? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. Not just how do we narrate, but also what are they about, and how do they show this entanglement of human and non-human spheres. But there's more. I think we have to use these narratives also to think about ourselves, human beings. Who are we? Who are we inhabiting this planet in transition? Who are we, scholars of the humanities and the social sciences, in relation to the natural sciences? But also, what is an environment? Could an environment be a character of a narrative? As some critics have claimed about the Mars trilogy, that the planet Mars is the main character of the novel. But could it perhaps also be a narrator? What does that mean? I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting question to ask. And to go back to us, how can a science fiction novel provoke new forms of scholarship, or at least, push in certain directions? So I read these texts through interdisciplinary scholarship, and I should definitely also note scholars here at the center, for example, Sai and Kata doing work on symbiocultures, I think is a very good example of this kind of work of interdisciplinarity that I think is very connected to this genre of science fiction. And last but not least, also, Kim Stanley Robinson is not just a writer, he's also an activist. And that you can sense that in the writing. And I think that's another call to look outside, to not just focus on our objects and our corpus, but also on connecting with the outside, with quote-unquote normal people. That includes you. Basically, we're all in the same boat. Thank you.